We are in the first week of Sprint 39. We are working in these areas. These are carrying over from earlier sprints. Some of them will go out, some of them new ones will come in, but that's where we are for development. I won't read those to you in one by one. Active discovery items, eligibility. You've been in a lot of discovery with Olivia lately. On service, our objectives and goals and end dates and start dates. Thank you for all that work you've done. It was really appreciated. And some of these other areas we're working on today. Taylor is teed up to bring you employment outcomes if there is time. Don't rush yourself, Taylor. I'd like to show them some relationship management options that I showed the state SMEs yesterday. So without any further delay, Taylor, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Al. Yeah, so I'm going to be going over some mock-ups for employment outcomes. So this would be when you are, towards the end of the customer's career plan and they have finished their employment goal, and now we're ready to enter that employment information. So let me get my screen shared. And let me get my chat open so that I can see that. All right. So feel free to ask questions along the way in the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourselves as we go through this. So we'll kind of go through this as a step-by-step on how you would enter employment outcomes for a customer in IWDS 2.0. So the way that we are envisioning that this is going to work is that when you are doing your career planning and the customer has completed their employment goal. So step one would be once they've completed their employment goal and you're going in and you're updating that goal and you're marking the status as completed and then you save the goal, the system's going to prompt you to enter employment information into the system. There are only certain goals for employment that will trigger this information. So down here, this is the list of all of the employment goals that we currently have in the system. The ones that are highlighted will be the ones that will trigger for you to enter employment information. So that would be get a long-term job in a new industry, get a job like the one you've had before, starting your own business, using the skills from your training or apprenticeship to get and keep a full-time job. And then we did flag the other as well, because that could be, a broader sense of things that you might be entering regarding employment goals. So customer got their job, they got their job in whatever employment goal you had set up for them. You mark the status as completed, you hit save, and then you're going to be navigated to step two. And so the user is navigated to it's actually search and add employment screen, where you will be required to use the employment search feature. So I know currently in IWDS, when you're entering employment information, there is a search feature that you can use, and it only searches entity management. We were told a while back by the state that not a lot of the LOIAs use that search feature because not a lot of employers are in entity management, so you're likely not going to find what you're looking for. So more often than not, the career planners are typically manually entering that information. We are updating that in 2.0, and we will actually be using the search feature. It will be required for you to use. And instead of searching entity management, we will be searching Dun & Bradstreet, which if you're familiar with D&B, it's kind of like the largest, employment search feature that you can use. So it's going to have tons of information in there. So it's going to bring you to this search feature here, and there's going to be all these different fields that you can search by. The only two that will be required for you to enter to perform a search will be the employer name and the state. But you have other optional fields that you can fill out that would allow you to really tailor down your search criteria to get a more narrow search result for what you're looking for. So there is the doing business as, the DBA name that you can enter. You can enter in the full address if you choose to do so, in addition to the state. You can also search by county, you can search by LOIA, and you can search by location status. So if anyone is kind of used to EBS and how you can search in there, we kind of use some of the same search criteria that they use there with like the location status, the county, and the LOIA. So you will search by whatever company your customer has indicated that they are employed at, put in all your information, you'll hit search. When you hit search, it's going to pull back results. So then it's going to populate a table down here at the bottom. And my example I did here is my customer, their goal was to become a truck driver. So they finished their CDL license and they got their license and they applied at Dot Foods, which if you're familiar with Central Illinois area, you probably know Dot Foods, but they got employed at Dot Foods as a truck driver. So that's what I'm putting in is I put in Dot Foods, I put in Mount Sterling. I didn't know the street address. I just put in Mount Sterling, the state, and the zip code. And the results pulled up two different results. There's Dot Foods Inc. and Dot Transportation Inc. So Dot Foods is the headquarter or the parent location for Dot Foods. And then the transportation is a branch that is specifically for the CDL, like truck drivers. So as you can imagine, the less information you put in here, the more search results that could pop up. If your customer got employed at Walmart, for example, and all you put in is Walmart for the employer name in Illinois for the state, you're going to get tons and tons of results that you would have to sift through. So that's why we have all these other fields that you would be able to use to be able to really narrow down that result. Maybe you know that they got hired in Springfield at Walmart. So when you put in Springfield, it's going to, shorten that list to just the Walmarts in Springfield. And then maybe they got hired at the one in Freedom Drive. So then you put that address in and it tailors it down even more. So that will be what happens when you do this search feature. So it's going to really tailor it. You will have the table down here that will display the employer name, the address, their location status, their NAICS code, and their phone number. There will be a table hamburger that you can utilize as well if you do want to see information such as their DBA or their county or the LOIA that they're located in. So you can kind of tailor that if you're trying to look for a specific location and maybe you're not seeing it based off of the items that are in the column headers here. And then you will see here there are two tabs. So there's the DNB search, which is going to be your primary search that you'll be using, but there will still be an entity management search. However, it is only going to be a secondary search. So when you do this search and maybe what you're looking for is not in DNB, then the system's going to automatically also search entity management. We know that likely if it's not in DNB, it may not be in entity management, but there will be some nuances where they might be in an OJT, and that OJT is what you're entering in. So the OJT might be in entity management, but it might not be in DNB depending on how it's set up in the system. So if no results are found in DNB, then it'll tab over to entity management. And if there are results there, it'll show them just like this here, but this tab will be selected instead. And then once you do select you find your employer that you're wanting to use, you'll be able to click the select button here to select that employer, and it will automatically take you to the add employment screen, which we will go over that in a few moments. Real quick, Rory, let me look at your questions in the chat. So question one, is this method of entering employment job records going to be part of the assessment or the career plan? Or is this a way that we will be entering employment records job entries in all aspects of the customer application profile? So this is specifically for employment outcomes. So this would be when you are entering the employment based off of their goal being completed. However, I know there will be other places, especially when you get into like the assessments, when you'll be entering like current job information or past job information. That we'll have to kind of discuss when we get to the assessment piece. If we want to use the same search feature, we can definitely flag that as we get into the assessment piece of things. And Rory, I hear you came off mute.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just gonna say thank you. Yeah, because sometimes, we're my horse blinders of the current IWDS system, I'm thinking, oh, well, this is just, there's like one work history section So in the exit panel, when you select a job, if you've entered a job that you're going to exit them with, if the reason is entered unsubsidized employment, it's all kind of like in, which isn't a bad thing. That's actually a good thing with the current IWDS is that, all the work history, there's one place where you would find all that. So I just didn't know if this would look different, if this is specific for the goals and objectives or career plan, or if there's like one hub where there will be a quote unquote, employment history, like it currently is in IWDS, where this is how we'll enter all the job records.
So we do have, and I'll fast forward all the way down here. When you get to the outcomes tab within the customer's profile, there will be a section. So this is where all of the outcomes will live, is on this tab. So this is where you can go to view their credentials. This is where you can go to view MSGs, employment, and education. All of the employment outcomes will be listed on this table. So anything that they got employment-wise that was part of their time with WIOA. So this would just be the jobs that are entered like while they're in WIOA. It would not be their previous jobs.
That's okay. Thanks. Yeah. So like if they're dislocated worker, the job that we're entering, maybe it has a DETS number, or maybe it's just a layoff, but for whatever, that work history prior to them being enrolled and determined eligible, this is specifically just the outcome.
Correct. Yep. This is just specifically outcome employment. And we can definitely have a space where you can view all of that, like their prior work history that you can go back and look at as well. But for this specific mock-up, it's outcomes only.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep. And then let me look at your second question here. If the search is required, would staff users still be able to override yes, or enter an employer name if they cannot find it, or if the customer ends up becoming self-employed? So absolutely. So we will force you to use the search feature first. If something does pop up, we will have you use this just to keep things consistent. But if you do a search, especially if they're self-employed, they're not going to be in Dun & Bradstreet. But once you do the search, if no results are found, what will happen then is it'll come down here and you'll see in the table that it'll tell you no results found. Click the button above to manually enter information. So then you'll be able to click this button and you will still be able to enter in the information, that the employer information. You'll just have to fill out all of the fields that are required. Not that all of these are required, but you'll just have to fill out all of the required fields to enter employment. That got really close. When you select one of these items from the search feature, when you get to the add screen, it'll auto-populate all of the fields that it can from Dun & Bradstreet or entity management. So if you do the add manual feature, then you'll just have to fill out these other fields with the names, address, and all of that fun stuff. So Cassie, you had a two-part question. You said, is this linked to the universal plan? Yes, this is linked directly to their universal career plan. So this will be entered in as part of completing their employment goal if they had one of these highlighted goals on their career plan. And then the second question, what happens if they don't find employment after the plan? So what would happen in that instance is maybe if they had an employment goal, and in this example, it's like that long-term job in a new industry, and they're not successful with it, and they don't end up finding a job, you would likely then end up coming into this goal, and you would be selecting the status as discontinued because you've ran out of WIOA resources. Maybe they have, they've gone 90 days without a service, et cetera, et cetera. If they can't find a job and they are no longer active and they're going into that exit reason, then if this is labeled as discontinued, then you will not be prompted to enter employment. However, let's say they didn't find employment at this point in time, you discontinued the goal, but then maybe you find out, 2 months later that they did get a job, but you've already discontinued their goal. When you're on that outcomes tab within the customer's information, there will be an add employment button that you can click that will allow you to add employment that way as well. So you can add employment through the actual employment outcomes tab, or you'll be able to add employment only if you are marking one of these goals as completed.
Thanks, Taylor.
You're welcome. And then let's see, Robert said, will IDES employment on client still be uploaded in the new IWDS? Yes, we will still be uploading that information. That will be part of post-exit outcomes, and we have not started discovery on that. So we will definitely be looking at that later down the road. And then Paul, let's see, when we choose a company that shows up in the search, NAICS code is already entered. So yes, it should pull the NAICS code for this employer that is on Dun & Bradstreet. And then for entering self-employment, how would we choose a NAICS code? IWDS currently has a code for that we can search for. So are you saying there's a NAICS code for self-employment, Paul?
Yeah, I think if I remember, it's been a while since I've done it, but and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but currently in the IWDS, there is something that talks about self-employment when you do a search for the NAICS. You got to do it in a specific way, but I believe there's a code that you can put in. So if we're putting in self-employment and it's require a NAICS code, how do we get that?
That is a good question. I'm going to make a note of that because I'm not sure if we have talked about that yet with NAICS. So I'll flag that as something for us to look into. But we'll make sure that you'll be able to either enter the self-employment type code or be able to select something that says self-employment for you to be able to do that. And then let me see. Lisa, you said, what would be the reason someone would use other for the employment goal? Olivia, if you're on with goals and objectives being your sweet spot, I don't know if you could talk on that question a little bit as to why would someone select an other when entering an employment goal?
Yeah, so on all of our goals and objectives, we have the list, but at the bottom of each list, we will always include the option of other. If that is selected, a text field will open that says, please describe this goal, where you can manually type in that goal. In the event you're serving a customer who maybe falls way outside the regular box of customers we serve, that does have a one-off employment goal that we haven't thought of, or education or training or objective, whatever it is, we always wanted to include those others as an option so you're not stuck within the confines of what we have come up with our preset lists.
So the other that gets added in would most definitely, if they completed it, have an employment. Therefore, that's why you have them included in the automatically add the employment in.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood your question.
No, yeah, no, you answered my question, but there was kind of a follow-up to that. So how it's highlighted here, it says other is being highlighted, it will trigger employment information being entered. It is because whenever a person is using other, it has to be as if they are getting a job. It just didn't fit into necessarily any of the ones that are selected above. So they have
yeah. So
and
they'll have
go ahead.
They'll have the category, the type of goal selected as employment with the other, and then define it. So we're assuming here that it is some type of other goal related to employment. If they pick other under like training or follow-up, we obviously wouldn't trigger employment.
right.
And Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the event it's like a one-off that happens to not have a direct employment link, but it is employment related, they're going to be presented the modal, but it won't force that
Yes,
employment
that's
has to
exactly
be
what I
entered.
was getting ready to say.
Okay.
If they select other, I think what we would do is then have, maybe even before you get to this search, have a different thing, like a question pop up that says, like, did they obtain employment through this goal? And if you say yes, then you would go through this feature. But if it's like a one-off that, like Olivia just said, that maybe it's employment related, but it wasn't actually them getting employment, you could say no, and then it would not force you to enter employment into the system. So it kind of would give you that option if other is selected. But if the other highlighted ones are selected, it's going to push you right through this And if the non-highlighted ones are selected, once those are marked as completed, it will not force you to enter employment.
Okay.
So my question would be, is this would be an audit lookup for when DCO pull clients files to see, because the other sometime, sorry to say, case manager does not put down the true definition of this employment goal that would trigger employment information being entered. Say they put something generic in there. Who is monitoring that section to make sure that question is filled properly and to meet DCO requirement? I'm just curious about it, because if y'all go in there and look and just see that this, oh, we didn't have nothing else to put in there, is that just good enough? Because sometimes the career advisor just put anything in there and nobody is monitoring that until somebody look at that file and say, well, why is this in here like this? So who's monitoring this?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Robert. You're
So you
saying
mean,
somebody's,
like, others, if they select other and they're just putting in whatever they want, who's monitoring like what's being entered and how it's being used?
Correct.
who's currently looking at your guys' career plans to make sure they're not just writing, because they could just write it down on a paper career plan now. Who's looking at your current career plans to make sure they're not just writing nothing relevant?
I would think there would be more of a technical assistance piece to it and not like a finding that's being monitored, that the local areas, if they do pull that for monitoring and see that would be more of, let's have a conversation as to why you're using or doing certain things. I don't think it necessarily is not following a policy. I think it's just
More
training
of
for that
it could
staff
be more of a
person.
corrected action
Yeah.
procedure to make sure you're doing stuff correctly. And that's why sometimes it's like, who's watching what's putting in? Because we deal with a whole lot of clients. We can't monitor everything. Hopefully the system can start catching something and say, this doesn't make sense, or I doubt that will happen. But sometimes within the new system, we want it to be able to give us some kind of guidance and stuff and say, hey, some stuff is somewhat out of whack, doesn't make logical sense.
We
And
are going to run regular reviews of the others used in all the areas so that we can capture, like, are we missing something that we see a lot of people putting in as other? And I'm sure we will also catch, like, somebody clicks other and then we say, please describe that, and they just type other. We're going to catch that too during those reviews. And I think you're right, Lisa, it's like a technical assistance. We can create dashboard rows that flag, like, these are all the customers using other as the goal type. But the system won't be like auto reading those and like rating if they're relevant or not. But we'll have various manual reviews happening throughout the year.
And like you said, Robert, that would be also kind of like a corrective action thing for the LOIA level. So if you have a career planner who's consistently selecting other and then just like typing in other, then that would be like, hey, we need to have a conversation. You know, what are you doing, kind of thing. But if they are using other and they are putting in, you know, smart goals that make sense for that customer that maybe don't align with the buckets above, then that's what the feature is for. But if they are using it to cut corners, then that would be something that would be caught, that should be caught and discussed with the career planner.
thank you. Just want to get clarity, make sure everybody is on the same page, because the better we make things in compliance and the way stuff is doing, the better.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert. And then Lisa, your other question in the chat was, if employment is automatically pulled, is there a way to pick that one for this purpose? I think when we get into looking at that IDS data and how it's pulled in, if an option we could end up doing is if it's pulled in at this point, it could be like another tab on here that was like, this was pulled in for this customer. And if that's correct, you can choose that one. I know that data is very limited. You don't get a lot of information from the stuff that's pulled in from IDS. But if we can implement that feature and make it, like I said, like another tab where if it's already pulled in and we can say, according to this data, this customer is employed at Dot Foods, you could select that and then it would auto populate the rest of those fields that you got there, and then you'd fill out everything else.
I'd imagine
Yes,
you'd still
yes,
have to
please.
add, you'd still have to edit that screen because as it is now with the in IDES's system, I think they get that from Biz or Biz Legacy.
It's limited.
Yeah.
It's limited, but I highly am recommending that you guys do that, because sometimes the customers do not share. They just don't, period. No matter what, no matter how many times, no matter what we've done, no matter how, all the types of stuff that we have done for the customers and working with the customers, they will not share. And so our staff person might not necessarily know, but if it gets pulled, those are a lot of times where it just automatically gets pulled, and it allows for us to have that discussion with them. Hey, we see that you're employed at yada, 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 let's talk more about that kind of thing. But if that's
Yeah.
not one of the features, or if it's not there, I highly recommend it. And it will be much, it's just another tool for our staff, because work number is downright not cost effective. I mean, it
No,
is absolutely out of control expensive. And if we're able to use those other tools, we try to use as much as we can, using our Sherlock Holmes kind of mentality.
Yeah. So I have two responses to that. The first would be, so in this instance, when you are entering employment from this goal, we would assume that you are not marking this goal as completed unless you were made aware that the customer has received, employment. So in that instance, we would assume that you are in contact with the customer. But
unless it pulls directly into
that's coming to response 2 in a moment.
Yeah.
So I think in this feature, we could add another tab that allows you to see that data if it's available. Now, on the flip side, which is the second response, you have the customer who ghosted you. You have no idea what they're doing, and you don't know they're employed until that data gets pulled in. We did talk about that a little bit with the state about how, yes, we would still pull that information in. And we would almost consider it like a partial record, because it's not going to have all the information that we need for WIOA, but it's still going to pull in that they were employed at this information and kind of flag it for the career planner to do exactly what you just said. Like, start that conversation with the customer, or attempt to say like, hey, we got information that you're employed at Walmart, and open those doors. So yes, we would auto pull that information in, and whether or not it could be here, and it could also just be on the outcomes tab if you're not closing the goal at that point in time and you just learned later down the line that, hey, they did get a job somewhere. So we will be pulling in that information and looking at that. And then Paul, you asked, will the employment that is pulled in show the start date? I am not familiar enough with IDES to know if that pulls in, if there's anybody on from the state or SIU that needs that information. But I don't know what gets pulled in with that.
The start date automatically pulls in.
Okay, perfect. And then Paul, your other question was, at this point, when you choose an employer, is it going to also require the ONET code? How does that work? What are you meaning? Like, how does that work with the ONET code?
Yeah, so 2 things. So for the ONET code, like when we put in right now, when we say, hey, we're going to exit this person is working, and so we start putting in the information, it requires us to put in the ONET code and the NASIX code for that company. So in this particular situation, if we go in there and we're like, okay, we see this employer, so we click on the employer, is it going to require us in this employment record that we're entering now, the ONET code? And if so, how do we choose that?
So yes, the NAICS code and the ONET code will be required for you to enter. If it is able to be pulled from either Dun & Bradstreet or Entity Management, it'll autofill for you. If it's not able to be pulled, then it'll work just like the regular search feature that we have for ONET and NAICS, where you're going to have this search. Let me pull it up. And Mark, you have your hand raised if you want to chat while I'm pulling this up.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out Dun and Bradstreet provides the ONET code because that's the occupation specific, and the
That
business
I
has
don't know
many.
if they do.
Yeah, the
So-
business has many occupations, so I don't know how
Yeah.
getting
But
the
they would have the
information.
NAICS, correct?
The
They
Dun
should
and
have the NAICS,
Bradstreet
correct, but they wouldn't have the
tool.
ONET necessarily, unless it's a standalone type business like maybe CDL truck driving,
Right.
where
the
the
ONET,
only
you're
thing
gonna
that
have
does
to put
apply is
in-
CDL. But most businesses are going to have multiple because they're going to have management, they're going to have administrative, they're going to have workers, and it could be any number of ONET codes that might be applicable, related to even related to the training or not related to the training. So I think that's going to be a difficult one, and that's why we only have about a 30+% comparison rate when DOL gets our information to be able to compare. And it's low
Okay.
for every state. It's not unique to Illinois, but and even then, most of those, if not all, I don't want to speak and say all, but are coming from a manual entry from the career planner when they talk to the participant to find out what truly the occupation is they're doing once they've got employed. And maybe someone locally can confirm how that number gets in there.
Yeah, so how do you guys enter ONET code now? Like, do you just base it off of what the customer told you their job title is?
Most of the time you have to go by what they say. Some offices I try to be like pretty particular about that, so I always tell them, I mean, it's easier in a smaller office like ours. I'm like, if you're in doubt, like, ask me. Please don't put managers all other, like, if you're it's like, but I'm like particularly OCD about that, I guess. But for reporting, because a lot of what my job also is, with our workforce, with our WIB and our county board, we'll get members asking about, like, where are people getting jobs? And so, yeah, I mean, you kind of have to go by what the participant, reports, if they self-report their employment, as they get employment, during the course of, or at the conclusion of their training or other services with us. Sometimes, again, if they don't, like Lisa said, and I echo that also about being able to pull the IDES records. It's at least a start to cut down on the sleuthing that you have to, the detective work you have to do. But sometimes, or to Mark's point too, sometimes if it's a company that you kind of know, it's a if it's a Werner or Schneider, like, it's a trucking company. So and if the person trained in CDL and that job shows up in their IDES records, that okay, the employer has entered them on their payroll, you can sometimes you can not often, you can kind of guess, like, okay, they're probably driving a truck because they're working for a freight. Like, if you can tell if it's a company that specifically, specializes in like transport or freight, for example, and if they got training to do CDL, or if it's a climate control company, like All Seasons Heating and Cooling, in Chicago, and they went to HVAC, so sometimes you can kind of connect the dots. But yeah, for the most part, we have to rely kind of on, if and when the participant tells us that, hey, I landed a job and I'm going to be a accounts receivable or purchasing manager or something, or purchasing agent.
Yeah, and I think so. And then second part to my question was about the start date for when you pull in the information from IBIZ or wherever it's pulled in. If a person hasn't done a claim at all before, the start date, like if it'll like when the employer reports the employment, and you look up, the pseudo monetary benefit screen, which shows the quarterly wages. I'm assuming that's where the wages are pulling in currently from IBIZ to IWDS right now, but it doesn't give you the start date. So if there's wages showing in a particular quarter, without that start date, you can't really calculate how many hours they're working and how much per hour that they are earning. In that aspect of it, it's a complete guess. So without having that start date, you technically wouldn't be able to put in accurate information on that employment that's showing up in IBIZ that's being loaded into the system.
So what are you doing now with start dates in that situation? Are you just trying to make your best educated guess, or How is
Yeah,
that currently
so
working?
the guidance that we've gotten on that was that if they're working in the quarter that we're exiting them, we can take a best estimated guess on that quarter and enter that as the start date. If we can't really calculate that, what their wages are, because we don't have enough information, but there's wages showing, we can put dollar for the wage. And then obviously we probably won't be able to identify the job. And so we were given permission to use the employment that in the ISS or the IEP, the employment goal, that ONET code in there for the job, because the idea behind that is once the employers report all of the wages and everything finally gets uploaded, it would overwrite any kind of data that we have put in there from that employer.
Mhm. Yeah, and we had a discussion about that briefly too, about overriding that data. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And we do that post-exit piece when we're looking at like the second quarter and fourth quarter and the wages that are being pulled in and whether or not that makes the most sense. But yeah, we will definitely be looking into that information, excuse me,
Thank you.
on whether or not it will override or should it override. If you have hardly any information on your customer because they aren't talking to you, it probably makes sense to override with the information you get because you're making educated guesses. But like I said, we'll get into that more and what that'll end up looking like later down the line. Now, to go back to that ONET piece, if you have an idea of what you're looking for an ONET, we'll be using this is our standard like ONET modal we use in other systems. So you might have seen this already in like some of Al's stuff, but you'll be able to search for your ONET. This is currently set up as like a multi-select, but for this purpose, it'll be a single select. So you'll be able to either do a quick search if you know what you're kind of looking for, or you can open up the different trees to kind of see all the ONET codes that are underneath there for you to select. So you would just select the code that best matches what they said their job title is or their job duties are. And once you select that, then it'll pop up in here and you'll be able to save it. And once you do that, it will pull up right in here for you. Now, regarding if you don't know what the ONET code is because you don't know what their job title is and you can't do that like sleuthing, it's a truck driver place and they got their CDL license. I'm not sure if there's a better way to infer that, or you might just have to kind of do what you've been doing in the past. If there's any opinions on that, I'm happy to hear them here. Or if you think there's a way to make it work better.
Which part? I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Taylor?
For the ONET code, when you're selecting the ONET code and you don't know, like you don't necessarily know what their job is because maybe, this is the information that was pulled in and you haven't talked to the customer themselves, so you're not quite sure what their job is that they're doing at that company, and you're not able to kind of deduce it just by looking at, the job, like the company and their training is there. So you're not quite sure what to enter for ONET code. Do you think is there a way to do that better or just?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's, great that you guys are willing to explore that. I really don't know. I mean, at some point it just comes down to, you're going to have those, those participants that ghost you and that we also, when they, if they're going to get enrolled in services, whether it's, job search workshops or training, either way, we ask them to sign an authorization to release employment information, and as well as one for the training provider if they go into training. So like, hey, if you don't, we'll ask you to supply this information, but if you don't, we're asking you to authorize us. So again, it's like kind of like Lisa said. I mean, sometimes you hate to see it be so labor intensive, but sometimes when possible, if it's a company, we can look it up, especially if it's local. you know, if it comes up in the from IBIS, if it gets loaded up into IWDS, you know, sometimes we'll reach out to the company and say, you know, who do we do? Where's your HR personnel? You know, is there a phone number for employment verification? They'll say, yeah, fax it or email it, scan it, and email it to this. And you know, sometimes when possible. I know it's definitely not always feasible or time wise, it's not always possible, but that's another way. Sometimes we've done it, and then they just verify the, you know, and they say, well, we can't give this. I said, that's fine. You know, just, you know, job title, whatever you can give us, you know, if we can get the starting wage, that'd be great. But, you know, then sometimes you have to do similar to what, you know, Paul was explaining, where, you know, once you get a couple of quarters, at least one full quarter, then you can kind of get an idea of like, okay, if that was their wages for one quarter, this one, it's like half that. Okay, they probably started halfway through the quarter. You know, sometimes there's just a lot of sleuthing that has to be done. But yeah, the only other thing I can think of is like instead of the work number, which, you know, was mentioned, and that's not cost effective, is that, you know, we do ask participants to fill out to sign for us, you know, the authorization to release. And we specify, you know, we don't leave it open-ended. You know, we specify like, look, this is the only thing we will ask an employer, you know, and they usually they don't complain. They don't ask not to sign it. They usually do. And it just says, you know, we'll just ask for like, you know, job title, start date, company name, industry that the company's in. You know, if we need an employer, you know, if you can't provide this to us, then we're going to ask an employer to do it. And sometimes I know it's not feasible all the time, but sometimes we've done that.
At what point in the process do you ask them to sign that release of information?
We do that in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, we do when we prior to enrolling them in services, we ask them if they would sign it. Yeah, to be upfront.
And what do you provide to an employer? My brain is spinning, and I'm wondering if we could like incorporate something like that into the system and like the signature process, where they can optionally do that for you guys, so you have it as backup.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, we send that form, we'll contact the employer, and, you know, and then sometimes there's once in a while, you might get an employer that says, well, that they still will not, you know, provide that policy or something. So, but usually they do. And it's not terribly often that we have the time or the feasibility to do it. I was just saying, like, just kind of, you know, kind of grasping at straws, like, well, what else could be done? Like, well, we kind of do this sometimes. So, but yeah, we would just send them, we'd say, hey, we have an authorization to release. Where do you know, and a lot of companies will have like a specific number for employment verification. They're kind of used to that, you know, for people that if they're applying for a different job and they need to verify the work history, a prospective employer, you know, is going to call a previous employer. So larger companies luckily will have like designated units or departments in their HR departments, you know, that handle those calls. And so that's what we would do. We would just call and say, hey, if we send you this, would you, you know, with the employee's name, could you send us, fill out the form and send it back to us and see if they agree to do it.
A lot more companies nowadays, though, are sending us to work number or a comparable type of employment verification. By and large, it's work number. And in order for us to even maintain work number, it costs $15 a month. And then if you use it, it's $50 per person. It's insane. So we use it so sparingly, and it's only
that's not feasible.
That depends on the plan that you're on as well, because
that's the cheapest. That is the because we've gone through that. We are a nonprofit. It is the cheapest that we could possibly get, and it's that.
Well, we got used to be different.
It used to be
$130 a pop.
It used to be like they would fax it to you 5 business days later, and the cost was like almost nothing. It was so inexpensive, but we have gone back and forth because Equifax owns that. And we've gone back and forth with them, and that is the absolute cheapest. And it's not feasible. So we use that very sparingly. And a lot, I mean, you get all the information that, you know, more so than you would in IBIS or IWDS or anything like that. But it is incredibly difficult sometimes for getting the documentation to support employment. Because the customers, they'll tell it to you over the phone, but they won't write it to you. They won't send you a check. They won't, you know, or pay stuff. They won't do it. They just, period, will not do it.
And that going in, that actually makes a good point here. When you're going into the add employment screen, these are all the fields that you can fill out when you're entering employment. And you will see source documentation down here. It is an optional field specifically because we know that that can sometimes be a challenge. We know that you need to have source documentation, but we don't want to prevent you from entering employment information at this time because your customer won't send you, you know, like you said, like a pay stub or written documentation. So you will still have that option to upload source documentation if you have it, but it's not going to prevent you from entering that employment info. So when you're entering employment here, the asterisk fields are your required fields that will have to be filled out. Job title should have been asterisk as well. That's my fault. But you will have to have your employer name entered, the address. The one thing I will note for employment status, when you're entering directly from your goal, it is going to auto default this to entered employment because we are assuming that you would not be completing their employment goal if they were fired from their job already. So it would be auto defaulted to entered employment, but once it is entered and completed, and maybe you find out like a month later they did get laid off or fired or quit, what have you, you would be able to go into that record and you'd be able to update it to say terminated, quit, what have you, and then basically have this as a record on their outcome because it was related to their training or whatever they were doing with WIOA. But then maybe they get a new job, then you'd go through this whole process again, and then you'd have more than one employment record here. But for this purpose, entered employment would be auto defaulted. Start date will be required, and same thing with the entered employment. There will be no end date here because we are assuming that if you're entering this based off of their goal and objective, that they shouldn't have an end date. But when you go in to edit it here, an end date will be available for you. Paul, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of need an explanation on how this would work, because if it auto defaults to entered employment, like on the use side, you don't necessarily need to enter in like at eligibility employment information. And so then let's say they're working at eligibility, right? And so they go through the program and they exit from the program because we lost contact, we can't find them, it's past the 90 days of no service, right? And so we exit them. But after that exit, we find out that they're still working, and it's working at the same employer that they had when they first came into the program. So if we put that employment information in, right, it should be still employed, right?
So in that situation, would you be entering it twice? Because I would assume that you would have captured that information like in the beginning. Sorry,
right, but it's not required for youth to put in past employment information.
Okay, so you're saying like, what if they didn't enter that information, but now here you are entering it?
Right, after, so even like when I'm going to be exiting them, I say, oh, they're still working at this employer, right? And I noticed that the career planner didn't put that in at eligibility, but they're still working there. So like, because if I don't put it in there, right, and I wait for the IBIS information to load into IWDS right now, it's going to count it as entered employment, and it's going to count in the performance measures. So should it default to entered employment, or should it say continued employment?
So this is only in the situation if you are entering it from this goal, employment goal.
Okay.
If in your like your example that you're using here, you could click the add employment button here and it's going to pull up the same information, but it's not going to have this auto default here. It's going to have the full selectable drop down for you because it's not being added from your goal or objective.
Okay,
So then you could still select like still employed for that information.
perfect. Thank you.
And then back on here, you will have job title, which would be required. Job duties, if you have them, you can enter them. Their wages, one thing we are going to kind of pull down on this is in IWDS right now, there's a lot of options you can select for wages. It's like per hour, per day, per week, per month, per year. We are only going to give you 2 options here, which would be per hour or per year, so that it's a little bit easier for you to kind of do that wage data. And there's going to be some parameters in place here so that if you put in a wage, is there per mile? I would hope we don't put wages. Oh yeah, per mile, I guess could be.
That's for the truck drivers.
Yep.
I would, I get where you're coming from. Sorry, I didn't mean to interject rudely.
No, please interject.
I would, I'll defer to the consensus, you know, as always, but I would argue against that only because we had cases where case managers here, or maybe even another LWIA with one of the truck driving schools that we own, an RLWIA, in Illinois WorkNet. Remember, until recently, it was in the WIO approved provider search pages. It was going back. There was a little bit of a lag of a few quarters, but it was pulling performance data. And I think it was College DuPage Truck Driving School. They're like, why is it saying only like $4 an hour? And as I was looking and researching, I trying to find some random exiters. It's like, oh, because they were accidentally putting the, 54 cents or $1.20 or whatever a mile. So we could have that feature in there, but when you're doing like some of the reporting in IWDS, like pre and post wage analysis report, that could skew the numbers. But I do see the need to, like, if a participant that you funded through truck driving training reports that that's what they're making, then yeah, there'd have to be some kind of, it's harder. It's tricky because then you got to do the conversion. So, I mean, I understand the benefit of having it. I'm just saying, like, cautionary, like that there would have to be, I think at some point from a performance and, outcome tracking point with the wages that would, because I had explained into that truck driving school that, like, oh, it's just because of, the mileage was getting, the rate per mileage was getting entered. It's not the hourly wage. It's just the system converted it that way, So I was just saying, just be cautious of that and of if having a way to convert that if possible. So.
Yeah, and Paul included in there, like, if we did include that, maybe have a field that then requires an estimated like weekly miles driven.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is
Mhm.
somehow someone would have to indicate both the number of hours and over what period of time we're looking at. Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Estimate. It's only going to be estimate because I don't think anyone can, unless we're looking after the fact and say, okay, we've got your quarterly breakdown. Tell us how many hours you worked during that period of time, to where we could break it down by an hourly rate. But unfortunately, we can only submit certain ways in WIPs, and so we're limited to what they ask us.
I've always, I've always asked them, how many miles per week were you hired to drive at? And so then that's just an estimate that they give me. They say, well, I was hired, they said I'd be getting 2,000 miles a week. So then I have all of the information now to calculate an hourly wage.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, if we think, and Mark, more specifically for like reporting purposes, if we think that would work, we could add per mile here. And then if they select that, the hours per week could say, like Paul set up here, like, estimated miles driven per week or something like that. Make it easier for you to do that conversion. But I'm not familiar too much with like WIPs and what has to be put in, and if that's something that you think would be beneficial for state needs.
And if we do that with the mileage, how would the wage analysis report calculate that total? Would it be a formula for that if you get a somewhat of an estimate mileage per week, per
Yeah.
month?
Well, I
statistic?
think we could do that. I mean, there's in the Teagle, there's a conversion chart, but it doesn't address this thing as far
Correct,
as
yeah,
mileage being,
Mhm.
but I would imagine we could do that to Paul's assumption. If you tell me you got $100 a mile and you drove 500 miles in a week, then we can figure out what your weekly wages were. The only problem with that is, and why maybe they didn't do this as a conversion, because if I pay you $100 a trucker, that isn't only wages. We're paying for your expenses as well in that,
correct.
unless they can separate it out. Again, I don't know how every company would do that. I don't know what a participant could give us immediately, but if it's just simply a straight fee and you pay for your gas and you pay for your other expenses, then how do I know how much you actually earned from wages just because you gave me a mileage number? It's
Yeah,
really
that's
a
the same,
difficult one. It's interesting that you bring it up because, again, the Teagle doesn't address this as an option.
because I get that as well. I mean, they telling me, well, they gotta they gotta fix this, they gotta do oil change, they gotta change the tire. They give them just a flat amount, but they don't take in consideration all the money they spending. So they, let's say they may get 2,000, but after they take care of everything they needed to take care of, that 2,000 might come home with only 800,
Yep.
similar to
Yep.
our taxes.
Yeah, and I imagine could be different in some companies where they do separate it out. So I'm paying you by mileage, and oh, all right, if you're staying if you need other expenses, I'll also pay you that. But I don't know how many companies do it that way versus just a straight mileage to cover everything.
Yeah, because I think if you work for like UPS, they cover their own truck. They pay you a flat rate. But if you're an independent truck driver, you everything is on you. It's like having a 1099, and everything you got to anonymize and stuff. So I don't know how that's going to work, but yeah, we should see, Mark.
In the comments, add some of that information. So at the state level, or I don't know, Mark and Laura, I'd really be interested in that anecdotal information from a quality jobs perspective. That way, at least professional development and technical assistants could have, make sure career planners were noting those real concerns or items when a person's wanting to go into a specific field. Where would be the best place, or how could we capture that to kind of compile that information?
The only thing I'm thinking is the information we can find that they're already talking about bringing into um, records is from like ONET, a website like that shows average wages. You can pick it by even by I think at the county level, but at least the local area level, state level. It'll tell you what generally benefits provided. I mean, there's quite a wealth of information on their page, and I'm sure there's other pages we've talked about internally that could be used, but I don't know outside of knowledge from the industry itself. I don't know if anyone break it down to that level to say, well, in addition to this, you're going to have these expenses. But to me, if they're telling you a wage, that's a wage. That's not a wage minus already having subtracted all the expenses. To me, I mean, to me, it's a wage. So,
Yeah,
I don't think they have anything specific that would break all that down. The
right.
industry might, but I don't think ONET puts it there.
And it's definitely not at this on this page. I don't think it's just more you all bring up a really good point that I think that we need to gain that information somehow. So if you all can think about, like, from a local perspective, what could be a feedback loop um to get that kind of anecdotal information, I'd definitely be interested. But I know that kind of takes us off topic, but I just wanted to make sure that was added to the conversation. And Olivia, maybe we can add that as a talking point at the state level when technical assistance and things like that is discussed. For whoever is on the
Is
call
there
for-
going to be features within this that if you accidentally put in, $15 and it's supposed to be per hour, but they put it for the year?
Yes, that was actually what I was getting ready to mention before the mileage conversation got brought up. So
Okay.
that's one of the reasons why we want to make this, you don't have as many options. So it's going to be per hour or per year. And there is going to be some back end parameters set up in place to kind of catch those mistakes. So if you typed in $50,000 and then you accidentally selected per hour, the system's going to say like, whoa, no, that's not right. I mean, I would love to make $50,000 an hour, but we know that that's not accurate. So we will put some parameters in place to kind of help catch those mistakes. And that's why we took out some of those other options of like per hour, per week, per month, per year, because that gets a little bit more nuanced in those wages. But per hour, per year, such as, opposite ends of the spectrum that we can set parameters up in place. So if you're putting in $15 and you put per year, once again, it'll flag you and say, like, verify that this information is correct. So there will be some flags for you in order to do that, to limit the errors that'll be entered in when you're putting in wages. And then other than that, you would have your hours per week. I think, I flagged the mileage conversation for us so that we can circle back to that. It is definitely something that I'll bring back to the larger state group and see if it's something they want to have added. And if so, we can get that in there. If it does get added, I do like that suggestion that Paul put up there to have you enter like the estimated weekly miles driven, so that you at least have a way to calculate an estimated weekly wage for that customer. You will then you'll have the option to enter in their contact name and contact phone if you have it, and then the NAICS and the ONET that we already discussed. And then there will be a comments box here as well. So if there's any additional information that you want to enter regarding this employment that is not any of these fields, you can enter them in the comments. And then that source documentation for you as well that you can upload if you have it. Once you're done, you hit save, the employment record has been entered, and then it'll show up on the outcomes tab here. You will be able to go back and view the employment record and then edit the employment record as well. So as I mentioned earlier, if you find out, maybe 60 days later that your customer got terminated from their job, you can update this job to reflect terminated. And then that would be a point where if they're not exited yet, to then like reevaluate their career plan and what can you do to help them get a new job. And if you do have a new job that is entered, it'll be listed here as well. Any questions regarding any of this? I got a little bit of time left over for Al if there is not questions, but I'll open it up to the floor before I pass it over to Al. Thank you all. That was a lot of great feedback from everybody. I got a lot of great notes to put down, and if anything does pop up, feel free to put it in the chat while we're wrapping up for the day. Al, I think the floor is yours.
How much time do I got? 20 minutes?
Yeah, a little over 20 minutes.
All right, super. Okay, that's enough. Let's clear everybody's head and let me jump into a new topic. Relationship management. Some of you folks probably aren't involved in it. Some of you are, or some of you might have contacts or connections with people that you can talk to them about. So I'm going to show you a couple mock-ups. These are screen mock-ups that we showed the state yesterday. And I'm going to share real quick here. And we'll talk through these, and maybe you could provide me with any, type of concern, or also if you think, wow, that would be useful. Okay. So I don't know of you who manage relationships, but consider that you have a provider, you have entity management, you search for entities. And then once you search for an entity, right, you find locations. Once you go for locations, and this is in IWDS 1.0 or today's IWDS, then you go over to, let's see the relationships, you go into that. And then In fact, you know what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to bring this over here. I'm going to go over here and jump in it just to give you some understanding of where I'm at. For those of you that are familiar with today's world, and I'm going to show you some enhancements we're doing for IWDS 2.0 to try to streamline this process of relationship management a little better. Some of you have to do a lot of this, and it gets quite tedious. So we're trying to make that a little better than it is today. And let me switch over here and share a different screen for you before I show you our proposed enhancement to this process. So let me share. Okay. Can you all see this? This is the IWDS system today. Hopefully you can see that.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to search entity here and I'm going to search for city colleges. I'm going to use this because it's a familiar one here. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to look at locations. And I'm going to go to this Harold Washington here. I'm going to view this one. And then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to list relationships. Okay, so 7 I'm looking for. Now, we won't get into another deep dive discussion about relationships and how they associate with locations and LWIAs. But as you know, an LWIA, as you can see here, can have a relationship with a location. And let's talk about locations, not just entity itself, but the entity location. That's where relationship falls. And or 927, several LWIAs, but let's talk about this particular one. Let's talk about 7s, and let's view that. And this will be familiar to you. So if you see here, active relationships, we have 1A, one D, 1E, 1N, and 1Y. And Chicago chose to bump those out for long dates because this exact process gets very tedious at the end of the year. If you had these set at year annual or they had them set at biannual, then you are going to manage a bunch of these relationships. This is one provider location, right? Entity location, provider location. This is one location and it has all those. They chose to put 4 different funding sources in one, I think there's 4 here in one relationship. That's their choice. You can do that. Others may just have one funding source per relationship. So I'm not going to go any farther than that right now. We can talk about that in a second if we have time. But the basic issue is let's just say these end dates were 6/30/2025, 6/30/2025, all the way down through here, right? In order for me to update those end dates, I would have to go into this update mode, and I'm not going to do anything because I don't want to and I would change these end dates. Okay. Quite tedious. Say you got 80 providers or something like that, maybe, or maybe you got 50. That would take a long time. So there's 2 things that we are proposing in our entity management structure and our relationship user interface that we believe that'll help this. Okay. One is we're going to allow relationships to be set up without an end date. Okay. Now, that does not change the fact that there should be business processes around reviewing those providers and those relationships. It doesn't change the fact that we're going to have reporting that give you lists of relationships that need to be reviewed or that are becoming inactive at a certain point. It just means that we might be able to build a little bit quicker review and kind of approve and continue process with that. That's one thing we're going to do is end dates. Now you could also do what they do because end dates aren't constrained to a number of years. You could date them out there ways too, but this is the way they've kind of got around Chicago, kind of got around of ending something in 1 or 2 years and then going back into it because they have a lot. Now, if you're an LWIA that doesn't have a lot, you may say, you know what, this just makes it better for me. But you still have to have a business process for you to go in there and make sure that you either extend or create a new or whatever relationships at at least at the annual basis, so or sometimes so that you don't stop being able to get that provider's services assigned to a participant, right? A customer. So you still have to have that kind of business process around that, even if this is not end dated, even if if you continue with the same way you do it with end dates in a year or 2 years. Okay. All right. So that's what I wanted to show you as far as where this data is coming from, what this data looks like. And I'm going to show you in a little bit different way based upon how we're presenting data in 2.0 and what we're hoping to accomplish here to make this a little bit easier. So I'm going to switch back over to my other screen real quick. And I'm going to show you what we're proposing that should help. Okay. So we want to have, now we're going to still have the same way of driving into an entity, going to locations, going and finding the relationships. In fact, on the location screen, we have the relationships basically in a grid at the bottom of those locations, which you kind of remember, some of you, maybe some of you don't, but it looks a little bit like this at the bottom of the locations page. That's all going to stay. That's not going to change. The ability to edit and all those kinds of things. And in fact, I'll show you another way you're going to be able to get to that. But this particular screen, which looks a lot like your entity screen, basically is going to basically have the same type of filters, but the set here in this list is going to be basically provider locations that have active relationships. Okay, whatever time you go into this, it'll be a list of provider locations, active relationships. Now, you'll be able to filter by LWIA, but you will want to set that if you're a user and you're associated to an LWIA, once we get that all going with that, it'll default to your LWIA, so you won't even have to set that. But I just put like 03 here, which is not true. This is really an 07. Don't worry about that example, but this would be one line per provider location that has one or more relationships that are currently active. Okay. This should be like 5, but this is really 1. I'm sorry. Should be 1 because this is all in the same relationship. You could have these in different relationships, but I just happened to pick an example and put it in here that was only a single relationship with all these different funds. Okay. All right. So now the concept is you can find your providers, this defaults in, and if you find a provider, you can drop this down and it'll immediately show you the current relationships that are active, the relationship ID that's generated by the system now in 2.0, a optional local ID. This could be nothing or it could be something you can put on it. Okay. And the funding source, the start date, and the end date. Okay. And then if this is one that you want to update those end dates across the board, you can hit this edit button and it'll bring up this page. This page will show you the provider, the location, the address, and it'll have a default end date, which is going to be today. And all you have to do if you wanted to say, I want to end these, for example, today, then I could just hit this all and save. Okay. Or I could set this for a date in the future, have this all and save. So I could extend the dates or I could end them or all of them, or I could go in individually into these and check 3 or 4 of those and use this end date here, either the default one or what I enter, and save. When you save, that window closes and comes back to here, and you can shuffle down through here. All right. That's a lot to digest in about 16 sentences. What are some questions about this? And let me see if I can get chat up here if somebody needs to ask this way.
I guess everybody's being quiet, so let me start it off then.
Okay.
I can relate to some of what you are saying when you went back when you showed the IWDS and you had city colleges of Chicago or something, and you had all those titles enrolled under one provider
Yep.
relationship number.
Yep.
The problem with that, and we got away from, is that how you define if you just want the one N or the one E. You cannot separate it.
Correct.
So I created and where for one N, one E.
Right.
Yeah, the formula grants I could relate to. You could probably move that up to 2-3 years. DCO made it a point to tell me they would prefer me to update it every year because you never know what the funding might happen. I see
Correct.
you leave one N open to Kingdom Come, and that's a state emergency type grant. They want us to close that because we don't want no career advisor to get up in there and just enroll somebody by accident in that title, which have happened, and it got pointed out to me by Miss Lorraine and some other people at DCO. So I had to go back and inform my training manager, my directors, and sometimes even the career advisor. They need to close these things off as of this day. And
Yes.
sometimes they leave it open. So if you leaving it open, it seems like you're causing more work for you than anything else. Now with this new
Sure.
system,
Yeah, Robert, that's your option and your LWIA and your rules and all that. You can, like what you would see in your system. Let me zoom in a little bit. These wouldn't be under the same relationship, right? Just like this.
yeah, this one I
Relationship ID
like.
would, this local ID or this and this one here would be different. Okay.
Right,
That's how you manage them. And these dates could be different too. That's okay.
correct. That's
If
this
that's the
part
way
here
you
I
manage it,
like. Yes,
you
I
bet.
like it here
Yeah.
more than IWDS because it give me that flexibility
Yeah.
to turn it on and turn it off when I
Yeah,
need it.
that's right. And so you would see this, you would see a similar screen in your scenario with your provider, and you could potentially see 5 different ones. That's okay,
Correct.
but it would
Right.
work the same. It would work exactly the same. Those 5 would actually come in here. You would see 5 different numbers, and you would see potentially 5 different dates, and you could set them all to the same end date, or you could set some of them to the same end date, or in other words, if you're in your situation, you're probably not doing a deactivate, you're probably going to be always doing an extension, right? So you're going to be,
Correct.
because you put yours at 1 year and you come in here and say, you know what, I want to extend these 3 out 1 year and these 2, I'm not going to.
That
That's
would be
fine.
good.
And
That
you can
that
do
would be
that.
good. Yes.
Yep.
I like it within the new system how it would be set up because yeah, I can almost go almost 2 years under formula grants.
You
Because I'm
bet.
pretty sure, well, that's how much we're gonna get that the rest of the 1E, the 1N, and even possibility to trade. I can't leave those things open per what I was told from DCO. Now you close them because we don't want nobody to get up in there and start adding activity. Then they gotta send me a report, Robert, why this stuff is open. I'm like, oops.
No, that's right. And that's your choice. You can manage. That's why I said you have to continue your business processes around this. And we're even thinking one potential step more is we may have a review checkbox that may need to be checked for those long running ones. We're not sure yet on that one, but we may use the same interface to say, because uh, John Barr was saying, this is not a bad idea, but I'm a little bit, concerned that people aren't going to review them. And if maybe we need a process to say, hey, I reviewed this, maybe at this level, I check a box, say I reviewed it, and I go on and we record that. And then you have a report that says, hey, these haven't been reviewed, by the way. So that's another way too to do it. But the big thing here is whether you're extending them or you're deactivating them is we can do it a little, hopefully a little easier
That
than
would
drill.
be
And
good.
even in our system, if you drill down in there, right, it's quite a ways down in there to get to those dates. Because you're going to an entity, you're going to a location within the entity, and then you're going into the relationships, right? So it's a little ways in there before you can do that. So that's why we're raising this up to make this process a little better. Dan, go ahead.
Can you also sort by title or funding source and activity or service name? Because there are some that'll just help us locally, like do that mass extension, if you want to call it that. So example, trade runs on a different year. I know everybody else is done with trade, but you could
Right.
apply that to any sort of grant that's not July 1.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't have to be July 1. I just had it. In fact, it doesn't have to be July 1. They had one here.
There's different ways of grouping the relationships and then editing that group.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? Is
Yeah,
that a possibility?
It could be a possibility. We could also, when we come down to this other one, we could actually, or even in that one, we could sort these
What am I trying to say? I'm
in
trying
such
to
a
say
way that I know you're going to hear, but maybe you have, but that's, yeah, maybe in the same relationship or even a different relationship, you have a different end date on two of these. And you always want to keep those two, maybe one D and one A together, but these three are not together
I
as the
think
same.
trade's the easiest example. So we have, let's say we have a sub-award who runs the services, and then we have, whatever, a handful of training institutions, and they all, as of now, technically, the grant ends 9/30, and so we have those ending in those relationships as of 9/30. Once we get the new grant or we know we're going to get it, then we bump it out another year. So I'm wondering if the same can be done, because this could potentially help with like Robert's problem too. Whereas if you got a 1N grant or you potentially have multiples, and I don't know. I'm just trying to think about if there's a way of sorting to get to a subset of your relationships so that then you can edit that subset based on a couple different criteria, maybe.
Possibly. Okay. The only thing that might help is, no, I shouldn't say the only thing, I'll have to think through that. But the one thing that might help in this screen, in this pop-up is to be able to, and I'll explain this once I say it, to be able to save and exit or save and stay there. And why am I saying that? Is because if I wanted to touch three of these, say, with a certain end date, and then touch two other ones with a different end date, I would need to save and stay here. Otherwise, this thing closes and I have to reopen it, right? So that would be kind of what you're talking about, because all the relationships for this provider, we're still in a provider location scenario. All the relationships for this provider location, you may want, and you said, say you're in a situation where your relationships are separate, whatever, and some of these have different dates, but maybe there's a pair of them that have one set of dates and there's three of them that have another set of dates. You would still be easy to do one or two or three as opposed to do them all and hit a date and save it. One or two, hit a date and save it. I think that might work better than just having this close when you change some of these, because that, I see what you're doing and that would bother me because you would have to open this again. Now, understand that this page right here that we're opening up is at the provider and location level. And I don't think you would have a whole lot of relationships for each provider location at your LWIA.
Yeah, that's what I failed to comprehend. I was almost thinking about multiple
provide
providers in
locations or
multiple
whatever,
locations,
right? Like you're
potentially.
going the other direction, right? You were saying, oh, I want all my 1As for like all my providers to be a certain date. You know, that's a different mindset. It's coming in at a different angle.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. I just wanted to say, but you did bring something up. I think that it might be important, and that is if I want to adjust these dates and I don't want to adjust all of these dates the same, but I do want to adjust all the dates, I need to be able to stay here, save until I'm done, and then get out of here and go on. Because otherwise, I come back here, I got to edit again, come back here, and that's a waste of clicks. So I'm going to put that down as an enhancement for this.
Yeah, kind of like when you add a new user, you know how there's new
Yep.
add another or something like
Yep.
that. I don't
Yeah,
know.
like new and yeah, you bet. That's what I'm gonna. Yeah. I think that's a
Yeah,
good.
as long as we could go and just edit the end date, that's fine. The start date, we don't need to keep on going back and forth to change it. It can
Correct.
stay there as is. This is
Right.
the end date.
Correct. And that's what we don't have the start date in this thing. We just have an end date. You can change the end date in this screen. We don't really care about the start date anymore. You're either going to need to stop this thing or you need to extend it.
Correct.
Yep.
And then the start date will only affect when we're doing new provider, when we first enter it
Right.
into
And
the
that's,
new
you'll
system.
go the normal traditional way when you create the relationship and do a new provider. And you can still edit that relationship's start and end dates by using this link and going straight into the relationship edit, right? So you can still get there from here if you want to do that. But this particular thing it actually started out, we need a way to kind of disable these quickly and then it grew into, hey, well, let's just, instead of thinking just disable, let's think changing the end date, whether that's disabling it or that's extending it. When we come into this page here, we'll default this date to the current date. And so that way, if you just want to end that thing right today, you just hit this here or one of those and save it and you're done. Okay. You don't even have to do anything. Okay. Except a couple clicks. So like 3 clicks and you're done. Okay. So that's what this started out to be. But if you're extending dates, then you'll pick a new date and then you'll go ahead and select which ones and save it. And I think we'll save and continue. Okay. Let me see if there's something else here.
Also, let's want to make sure the case manager is not going to be allowed to get up in here and start adjusting it because I know that
No.
never
It's got to be role based. Just whoever manages your relationships today would have that role.
Okay.
That security role would be based upon, to get to this would be the same as whatever we have for managing relationships today. I don't think no case managers, or I don't think our career
No,
planners, any locals having any
right.
access to this. I
When I
don't
first
think.
started at Lake County, they had it all open. I had to go in there and do a whole lot of correction.
Yeah, that gets kind of ugly because, there has to be some kind of a knowledge to funding, a little bit of knowledge, right? It's like
Oh,
somebody
absolutely.
somebody somewhere says, "Hey, you know what? We don't have any funds for this provider to provide 1Y anymore," or whatever. Whatever that it could be. It doesn't necessarily, I know it looks like, a lot of these we do have on the program year, but it doesn't have to stop on the program year. It may stop earlier, right? So you may run out or whatever. I don't know how you manage that because we really are separate from, grant management is really separate from IWDS, but somebody has the knowledge to say, hey, you need to go over in IWDS and close that service out. We're not providing that anymore in this program year, or we're not providing it next year, whatever the case may be. All right, I'm over, but I hopefully was able to introduce that to you folks, and sooner than later, this will pop up in UAT, and you'll be able to play around with it. And I hope that it's a much improved interface for managing a lot of relationships at one time, because especially if you have those coming up on annual or quarterly or whatever you have, you may have a lot of them to manage. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you.
Anybody have anything else? Lynette or Taylor or Olivia, or
I'm good.
we're all good? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good lunch.
All right, you too. Till next week.
You bet. We'll see you next week.